Imagine there was nothing. No space, no time, no laws of physics, not even the possibility of something. What you're probably imagining is a dark, empty void, but there wouldn't even be darkness or empty space, just absolute nothing. But here we are. Here's you watching this video. Planet Earth, a universe with trillions of galaxies, each with billions of planets within them. But why? You, the chair you're sitting in, the building you're in, planet Earth itself, it seems everything that exists has a cause. That may sound like an obvious statement to make, but what if I told you this question, does everything have a cause, is arguably the most divisive in philosophy? Because depending on whether it's true or not, there would be monumental implications. Not just for understanding why there is something instead of nothing, but for how we live our lives. In this video, I'll break down the three main answers philosophers have to this question. First, the idea that the universe is just a brute fact with no explanation. Second, the possibility of what is called an infinite regress. And third, the idea of some kind of necessary being, with the third being so consequential for how we live our lives that it has divided thinkers and people of all walks of life since the dawn of humanity. But first, let's establish what we need to know before we tackle this massive question. Firstly, this intuition that everything that exists must have a cause is what philosophers call the principle of sufficient reason, or PSR for short. This idea that everything must have a reason, cause, or explanation for the way it is fundamental to how we understand everything around us. For example, if you walked into your living room and saw a mysterious box that had appeared on your living room table, and you asked your housemate who was sat at that very table, where did the box come from? And he just said, the box is a brute fact. It just is. You would certainly not feel satisfied with this answer, if not concerned for his sanity, because there has to be an explanation for the box being there. This is the principle of sufficient reason. And it's not just essential for how we function in our day-to-day lives, but also for every field of science and human inquiry. Well, you might be surprised to hear that according to the 2020 Phil Paper survey, 45% of philosophers either reject or lean against the principle of sufficient reason. This is to say nearly half of philosophers lean towards the idea that some things just are, with no explanation, otherwise known as brute facts. Many of these philosophers will tell you the universe is just a brute fact. It just is. No cause, no explanation, no reason. Well, there you have it, folks. We've settled the question once and for all. Why is there something instead of nothing? There just is. Well, not so fast. While this certainly could be the case, you wouldn't be alone if you thought this sounded like a bit of a cop-out. But first, let's look at why many philosophers think the universe is just a brute fact. To do this, we need to understand an idea called contingency. Contingency is the idea that something can only exist in the way it does if certain circumstances are met. For example, if someone has a cup of coffee on their desk, the cup of coffee is contingent on the desk to be held 3 feet from the ground. If the desk was removed, the cup would no longer be 3 feet high, as it would fall to the ground. Using this idea of contingency, we can establish a hierarchical chain of contingency for anything at any point in time. The cup of coffee is contingent on the desk, which is contingent on the floor, which is contingent on the foundations of the house, which is contingent on the ground the house is built upon, which is contingent on planet Earth itself, which is contingent on gravity, and so on and on and on we go. This chain of contingency could just go on infinitely, in what philosophers call an infinite regress. This infinite chain idea actually represents the second possible answer to our question, as some people do think an infinite regress is why there's something instead of nothing. However, this is a very problematic idea, and there's many reasons why, but I'll focus on two of the main ones. Firstly, in this infinite chain of contingency, each member is contingent on the previous member for its existence, and they're therefore all functioning off borrowed existence. So where is the existence being borrowed from? In other words, why does this infinite chain exist at all? There's no explanation for the existence of the chain, just each individual member of it. It would be like if there was a chandelier above you that was dangling off an infinite chain that just extended into space with no end. This would be impossible because there'd be nothing preventing the chandelier from just crashing to the ground. There has to be some stationary thing the chain is attached to, and if the chain is attached to something, it can't be infinite. And it is exactly the same for the infinite regress. There's no explanation for how it comes to be at all. It would be a fallacy of composition to say that because every member of the infinite regress has an explanation, that the infinite regress itself has an explanation. A fallacy of composition being the logical error of attributing a trait to something because the parts of that thing have that trait. Like saying, every brick in this house weighs 500 grams, therefore the house weighs 500 grams. And the second main reason an infinite regress seems illogical is that while infinities can exist in the theoretical, like in mathematics, they don't seem to be possible in the real world. This is because not only are there no known examples of infinities in the real world, but they do just seem impossible. One thought experiment to illustrate this is known as Hilbert's Hotel, which was imagined by the mathematician David Hilbert. Picture a hotel with an infinite number of rooms. Room 1, room 2, room 3, and so on, forever. And every single room is fully occupied. There's no vacancy. Now what if an infinite bus of guests arrives? The hotel can simply ask all the guests to move to rooms with odd numbers, freeing up every even-numbered room. Now the infinite hotel has an infinite number of empty rooms. It's a hotel that's infinitely full, yet always has space for more people. This thought experiment aims to show us that while infinities can work in mathematics, they lead to real-world absurdities. This suggests a foundational cause is needed in the real world. So, if an infinite regress is impossible, then there must be some kind of first cause or foundation that everything is contingent upon to exist. Many would argue that this is simply the universe and it's just a brute fact, as was famously said by Bertrand Russell. I should say that the universe is just there, and that's all. However, I don't really find this convincing, and it seems to avoid the question. This is because every single thing within the universe has a cause or explanation for its existence. And the universe is just the collection of all of these contingent things. In other words, it seems the universe demands an explanation for its existence just as much as the mysterious box on my living room table. However, some people may actually claim that there are uncaused events in the universe. And as evidence, they'll point towards quantum particles that appear out of nowhere with no explanation, just randomly. But the reality is, just because our current scientific understanding can't explain why this happens, that doesn't mean there actually is no explanation. And additionally, these quantum events are still contingent on the laws of physics to occur. They are explained by the physical laws of the universe. And just because in this case causality is probabilistic, that doesn't mean causality is absent. Therefore, these quantum events aren't unexplainable brute facts like some people might suggest. So, if an infinite regress is impossible, and the universe can't just be a brute fact, then what could possibly be the first cause of reality? This question brings me on to the final and by far the most divisive answer to the question of why there is something instead of nothing. This is the idea that the first cause of reality is some kind of necessary being that isn't contingent upon anything. Now you may be wondering, if everything that exists demands some kind of cause or explanation, then surely this first cause would also demand an explanation. But what if that first cause was a completely different kind of thing to contingent things? The principle of sufficient reason demands that every contingent thing must have a cause. So what if there was something at the base of reality that isn't contingent upon anything? To answer this question, we have to think about what it means for something to not be contingent on anything. We know that material things are contingent on other things in order to exist as they do, just like the cup of coffee being contingent on the desk to be held 3 feet off the ground. We also know that things that exist within space and time are contingent. And importantly, we know that things that could have not existed or could have existed in a different way are contingent on something else to exist in the way that they do. For example, my coffee could have not existed, so it's contingent upon me to make it. So considering these traits of contingent things, we can deduce that a first cause of reality that isn't contingent on anything would have to be some kind of immaterial thing that exists beyond space and time and couldn't have not existed. And by that I mean it exists necessarily and couldn't have existed in any other way. This argument for a first cause is most commonly known as the cosmological argument for a god. And it's one of the main reasons people find God to be the most plausible answer to the question of why there is something instead of nothing. But it's important to bear in mind that this argument doesn't necessarily lead to the traditional idea of a God that's personal and infinitely powerful and so on. Some people may argue that this immaterial first cause just acts as a first cause of existence and nothing more than that. So what are the arguments that this first cause would be like God in the traditional Christian sense? Well, there are many, but since this isn't the focus of the video, I'll just tell you the one that I find most convincing and try and keep it brief. This would be commonly referred to as the Aristotelian proof, an argument put forward by the philosopher Aristotle. In this argument, we have to look at things with an understanding of the potential and the actual. By potential, I mean what something could potentially be, and by actual, I mean what something actually is. To illustrate this idea, think of a cold cup of coffee. I apologise for the endless coffee analogies, but trust me, it will make sense and it will be over soon, don't worry. The actual status of this coffee is that it is cold, but it has the potential to be hot. In order for this potential to be actualised or made a reality, we need an actualiser, since nothing can actualise its own potentials. This actualiser would be anything that could heat that coffee up, let's say a microwave. So, when we heat this coffee up, we are actualising the coffee's potential to be hot, and making it actually hot. And in order to actualise this potential, we need an actualiser, which in this analogy would be the microwave. And there you have it. We've made a potential actual. And this idea of potential and actual can be applied to absolutely everything that there is. For example, a tree had the potential to become your chair, and this potential was actualized by the people who cut it down and processed it and made the chair. I don't know how people really make chairs, but there you go. We can then apply this Aristotelian logic to the coffee cup on the desk analogy. The cup of coffee has the potential to be 3 feet off the ground, and this potential is actualized by the desk. The desk then also has the potential to be held, which is actualized by the floor, which has the potential to be stable, which is actualized by the foundations of the house, and so on. We get another chain of actualizers. And for the same reason we explored earlier with the chain of contingency, it seems this chain of actualizers must have a first cause as well. This would be a first member of the chain that actualizes everything while not being actualized itself. Since it has no prior actualizer, it has no potentiality. If it did have potentiality, it would require an actualizer. This would just create another infinite regress. So what does it mean for something to have no potential? It means it has no potential to be any different or any greater. This means something with no potential is maximal in every way. This would include things like power, intelligence, knowledge, etc. This goes to show us how God is in fact one of the main philosophical answers to the question of why there is something instead of nothing. And it's the one that I find the most convincing. Of course, you don't have to accept this argument as well, but it's important to bear in mind that the argument's purpose isn't to prove God 100%, it's just to show that God is at least a likely possibility. So, which argument do you find the most persuading? Is the universe a brute fact? Is there an infinite regress? Or is there a God? Let me know in the comments. And if there's some other answer that I haven't considered, please do let me know as well. I'd be excited to hear it. If you enjoyed the video, please do leave a like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. And until the next one, bye bye.